Hello, good evening from Montreal. My name is Andrew King. I'm a senior partner and chief design officer at Lemay, and I run the Lemay Lab, our research wing. And I'm also a professor of practice at McGill University School of Architecture. I'm pleased to be joining us, or to having joined us here tonight, three colleagues of mine, it's old friends, people who've been part of a significant stream of research around the city's development, the contemporary city and its understanding in our culture. We've got Shauna McCabe. Shauna is the executive director of the Art Gallery of Guelph. And Shauna, are you calling us from Guelph today?
I am.
Oh, great. We've got Anthony Kiendl, who's the CEO and director of the Vancouver Art Gallery. Congratulations, Anthony. And you're in Vancouver this morning?
I am. Thank you.
Great. And we've from Venice, just to add a little exoticism, which is great, and somebody who's actually not on a different time zone. We've got Alice Covatta, who's a professor of architecture, city and territory at the University of Montreal. So welcome everybody. Thanks. This should be good. When Tim and I started talking, Tim Hasid, who's helping organize the World Cities Festival, started talking about a subject for this conversation, we talked about the city at night and its particularities. I was not that excited about it at the beginning, but then through some cajoling and through some conversations that Alice and I had on another subject, and then thinking about the work that I guess all of us have been involved in different realms, it really became more compelling for me, and also started to think about my experiences of living in large cities around the world. We've all had the opportunity to travel, but I've spent significant time in Rome and Berlin and in London, and understanding that those cities seem to have different identities, or at least they seem to have a distinct identity at night, or they gave, rather than be more specific, they gave us different things over the course of the 24-hour period. So I thought it would be an interesting discussion just to start talking about that and maybe speculating on that. I know that you're all heavily involved in the distinction, but if not the distinction, the convergence of art and architecture and physical space in many ways. So maybe we can just start to give some first thoughts on the city at night, some first notions. And maybe my job is to just, I guess, lifeguard a little bit. So maybe since it's the list, I'll ask Shauna first, just to make if you have any thoughts around just the subject before we get into some specific questions.
For sure. So I guess, as you know, I've been interested in the rhythms and spaces of and cities more generally. And as I was thinking about this conversation, it became really clear to me that it's difficult to conceive of nocturnal life of cities right now, and their role in urban futures apart from our current context. The effect of the pandemic has been to force a rethink of the status of the night and nightlife, as so many factors in the last several months have challenged normal rhythms and time sequencing and urban cycles. And I think some of the most striking visual culture that's come out with the pandemic, emerged with the pandemic, was precisely that, capturing the effect on rhythms within the city, and first images that were almost dystopian, images and glimpses of a world without people. And some of the most populated cities and sites were globally cleared, basically, and with orders to shelter in place. And then we see, with the imposition of curfews, images highlighting a real silence of confinement, one that was even more pronounced in places with the most robust nighttime economies. And so I think the restriction on urban rhythms was perhaps one of the most forceful measures associated with COVID-19, as human traffic disappears from the streets with devastating personal, cultural, political, and economic effects. And this has to have a social impact. I mean, streets are our main stages for urban life and public life. They're essential to how we use and interact with the built environment, connect to our communities, and encounter each other. And so streets play a key part in making sustainable and livable cities. So I think a lot of things have changed. And so I think when we're talking about the night, we have to be aware of that shift and just the impact of the last several months.
Thanks, Anthony. Any first thoughts on the subject?
Well, I'm always interested in, as a art gallery director and curator, I'm always interested in the reception of art and the context for that. In this case, we're talking about an urban setting, and I've always been interested in looking at art through a kind of intertextual process where it's presented in space in relation to the built environment and all the forces that surround it, and how that art both speaks to and is affected by that context and that environment. So the city at night, on a representational level, is obviously dramatically different than during the daytime, and that I'm really fascinated by how art can be both impacted, but also speak back to that context. So we've seen over the last decades the emergence of festivals like Nuit Blanche and very, very different responses to the reception of visual culture in those specific environments. On another level, I also think about, and as Shauna says, in this time, one is very conscious of, as a relatively frail human being. And by that I mean all of us as individuals in this environment. One thinks about issues of safety and community and well-being, and of course, as a curator, I've been very interested in art and health, and not to say that night is diametrically opposed to day. I think it's also, I think there may be some interesting opportunities around how people move through space that for different subject positions there may be advantages to nighttime travel or daytime travel. So I think my first thoughts go to intertextuality and health, and those are a couple of the areas that I'm interested in discussing.
I think that's a nice synopsis. It sort of touches on a series of things I think we can talk about over the next 45 minutes or however long we've got. This notion of art in the city and how it relates to health. We've got some subjects around maybe, is the night inherently a place of fear? Is it inherently a place, these series of thresholds, the thresholds of the night change with something like Nuit Blanche? So maybe we can start to unpack a little bit more. Alice, do you want to have a quick, or as quick as you want, as long as you want, first shot at the subject, and then maybe we can start hitting some.
Yes, it's a topic I've been interested more in, about the architecture and urban design perspective during the last 5 years, because I was living in probably one of the cities that exploited the most the 24 hours concept, that is Tokyo. So I've been living this kind of 24 hours peak city of activities and kind of interconnection between daily life and nightlife. So I've been very much exposed to this topic, and that's why I was really fascinated of studying also about the nighttime economies, and how I read a lot about also how we change our behavior during the last decade. So we tend to sleep less, we tend to work during the night time. So the limit between the day and night is very blurred. It's very complex. And I think there are many risks about this kind of new condition, and there are many social risks, because also the most important factors on the definition of the night city is about economical forces, and we are less able to control the social and cultural impact of these forces on the workers and all the people that are living during the night. So I think as architect and urban designer, I think we have a lot to think about, and we are not really acting very quickly about this. So I'm very excited about this topic. And so this is really a quick impression about this conversation that we're gonna start, so yeah.
I think that's a nice place to jump in, because you mentioned Tokyo, and I sort of posed a couple of questions for us in case we ran out of something to talk about. But this notion of Tokyo as the 24-hour city, and I used a couple of examples that I'm familiar with. Venice, I think Venice is actually more like a 12-hour city in a way. It sort of stops at night in a way. And Toronto, I would say the same. Sort of, at least downtown Toronto kind of stops at night. You know, and I know Rome quite well, where it's like the volume builds in Rome. It's well behaved during the day, even though it's full of tourists, and then it becomes very, in a way, kind of badly behaved at night. It becomes a kind of different place. At least Piazza Navona, Piazza Santa Maria in Trastevere, certain components of Rome have a different identity. Do we want to discuss that for a little bit? This notion of how a city's identity is framed around its either divergence or convergence of its identity at night and during the day. My role as a moderator. Anybody want to jump in, or I can? Oh, Shauna. Okay, Alice.
Yeah, just very sorry. For instance, Tokyo is very. Let's say, maybe I don't want to make contrast between Western and Eastern culture, but somehow Eastern culture has very long tradition of this night district and entertainment district. So the city itself is like built up around this kind of neighborhood where people basically just spend their time in between the time of work and commitment and between the time of going back home. So there is a kind of this gap. That is a kind of zone of evaporation, so where people just can freely let go their stress of daily life and daily routine. So I think in this sense, the city of Tokyo is very built around the satisfaction and also a bit narcissistic component of consumeristic approach of being able to spend as much time as we want in the city. And also I think there is a very huge component that is the public transportation that stops at a certain time. So there is this kind of threshold that probably in Tokyo is when the last train stop. So there is no chance we are like trapped in the city. So we have to survive there. So it's kind of this make a very huge impact on the perception of people that are more kind of relaxed. Finally, there is no time. We lose the control of time finally after a long day of commitment and planning management and everything. After the last train, we really can be free somehow. So I think that makes a big component of the 24-hour city in Tokyo. That is this no choice of going back home, just staying out. So
yeah, this notion of transportation and thresholds. I lived in London in the it was a long time ago. I guess it was the late 80s, and it was still when they had 2 or 3 night buses that ran the whole city. So if you really wanted to get anywhere at night, you had to get on the night bus, and it was a long, drawn-out process to get to wherever you were going. It became a kind of different tour of the city because of the limited, and it also was above ground because the underground was closed, and it really became a kind of different way and a different socialization for understanding the city. And maybe the thresholds that happen at night through different cities, when either the liquor stores close or the bars close or the subways stop or the transportation stops or certain things start to happen, become a kind of subject. Anthony, we talked about, you're talking about art and its place within the city. Again, I can remember being in certain places where particularly Berlin, when just after the wall came down, where art really became the night projection. It became a night element. It's something that was either ad hoc or organized, whether it was Jenny Holzer or then a series of young artists who were really making the city a canvas. And then it really I think it kind of led to a part of the new identity of Berlin as it evolved after the wall fell. I know I'm talking about ancient history, but do you think cities can, to Shauna's point, almost post-COVID or even now, just with a new understanding of the way cities function, new technology, do you think a city's role with this relationship between art can help us re-identify or at least recalibrate individual cities in some way?
Yeah, absolutely. Of course, so much at night is about electricity and the infrastructure of, I guess one could say almost like advertising technology and like projections and billboards and light. And so, introducing art into that context is, I think provides a relief from, constant stream of commercial messages and disrupts typical communications within the city. So there's really, an opportunity there. You mentioned, I'm thinking of a long history of artists, and you mentioned Jenny Holzer and artists, especially active, coming out of the 80s. It's also, I'm just thinking out loud, it's there at nighttime, there is a certain kind of art or media that become both more possible but also maybe are necessary, given the lack of daylight, that there's a kind of I guess it puts a frame around what how one intervenes in the environment, and not that it's better or worse, but there's different strategies would work differently in the daytime, but somehow the night seems to open up a canvas for projection and light and electricity, but also I guess different rhythms of circulation, different temporality. People, as we've talked about this morning, maybe a sense of freedom, or that a lot of day-to-day management of time throughout the day really becomes more fluid or somehow different, and that I think that disposition for viewers also affects the reception of artwork. So just as I'm thinking of it, kind of thinking out loud, I mean, there are numerous factors that I think, the after hours time creates these opportunities that I wouldn't say necessarily better or worse, but certainly distinct, and opportunities perhaps for things to happen in a different way.
It seems to me, it seems fundamentally different in a way. You're talking about a kind of ephemeral art, to whatever degree it gets recorded and documented in ways it occurs only for a period of time, and that period of time has to do with the nighttime. I see you're going through one of our thresholds behind you. The sun is rising in Vancouver. This notion of this, I sent out a couple of sort of more speculative sentences, and it was about the day being more about stasis, the night being more about flux, more about movement, ephemerality. This notion that it's going to change, and it seems to change more radically in the way we perceive it in some way. Shauna, I know you're interested in urban structures. Do you want to have
Yeah.
Do you have thoughts on that?
I guess, to me, there's this sort of constant dynamic tension. I think this idea of the night city and has become part of how cities are trying to differentiate themselves now in a economic and tourist landscape. And so with a focus on nighttime economies, and even cities are appointing night mayors, sort of just to actually, increase the capacity for economic activity. And then you've got also this sort of inherent flux of the night, which can actually contradict and undermine this idea of the more hegemonic economic space that cities are trying to create with the night. So, I think it always comes back kind of to this idea of like street, right, and sort of human scale activity. And the night has always been a place of transgression, where less conventional uses of spaces can be conceived and imagined and promoted, and really to seeking spaces of difference. And I think here, just of in the last few months, the really mass anti-racism protests we've seen associated with Black Lives Matters, and then also sort of in conjunction with curfews, right, that are imposed. So these sort of incidents really highlight how the night is also very politicized. And so, as a consequence of transgression, governments actually tend to formulate and implement more kind of policies to control and countervailing policies, which then generate more transgression. So I think this is sort of the ongoing production of night spaces, and I keep in my back of my mind is actually always the sort of writing of Henri Lefebvre about rhythm, urban space and rhythm, and that he actually talked about how nighttime basically allows for even in sort of really sort of rigid cycles of time that are structured by cities, there's always this sort of capacity for difference at night, and he was sort of interested in that and analyzing the potentials of that. So I would always sort of suggest that night isn't inherently anything. it's very dynamic and in flux.
I think that's great. I mean, the words sort of, I guess I wrote a question as you were talking, is the night inherently subversive, or is it just a subversive thing? Alice was talking about some of the economic systems that get that shift and change, and the nighttime is inherently challenging to certain systems within society that in some ways, I guess, demand to be challenged in some ways. The relationship with art, and the fact that art can be, of course, be transgressive, subversive. It's almost one of its key roles. So this notion about transgression and political manifestation. I mean, there was a period of time in Berlin where you could set your clock by when the anarchists would show up, and then 15 minutes later the police would show up. Mm-hmm. So it was a sort of organized kind of, and it was always just after dark. And this was, for a few days around May 1st. So this notion about, let's talk about that for a little bit. I guess this notion of night as really, in the simplest form, a kind of place of protest, a place of sort of politicized action. Shauna, maybe I'll get Anthony or actually Alice to jump in on that if I'm trying to be balanced.
Yeah, I think it's something that it's happening in many metropolis all over the world. So in North America, but also in Hong Kong or in Belarus, so that is like the nighttime is the time for protest and the time of manifestation of a kind of social individual sphere, at the same time a collective sphere. So I think it's a kind of transcultural movement that the night belongs to community, to events, and to protest at the same times. And I think it's, for me, probably because also night is kind of the time where we are free of the constraints of the daytime. So it's the moment of also, it's an unpredictability moment where everything can happen. And it's also this unpredictable moment is also kind of boundaries between the violence and non-violence that can happen during the nighttime. So I think it's kind of, I feel it's very dangerous to control the nighttime at the same and it's better to populate the nighttime. So I think that this direction is also something that probably urban planners and architects should kind of work on it, like to find that the nighttime is a place of project, as a place to populate the nighttime rather than to control it, because then can be actually the moment of crossing this line of violence. So I think it would be interesting to not frame on the controlling and surveillance perspective, but more on the production of projects that are more about the populate the nighttime. So I think that's...
Sorry, I think that this notion that a project can exist. So we always talk about, or we're not always, but urban designers, architects, artists, we talk about a specific, no, I guess I think Anthony was pretty clear that artists actually focus more toward that. But if we talk about larger projects where we seem to want everything to function in a certain way within the daytime, when there's light, when there's whatever, when there's commerce, when there's retail, when there's these things that we do when we're at work or we're commuting, or that sort of notion. But this idea that a city can specifically be designed for a kind of another project, the nighttime is a different project, and I think that's a really interesting question, I guess. And I guess the question I put forward further on that is, do we think this notion of protest, and maybe I'm trying to get back to the sort of previous, this notion of protest or this notion of the politicization of space at night, does that frame an armature for a different kind of project, a different kind of urban design or space-based project? Maybe I'll go to Anthony on this one.
Well, yeah, what's interesting about context of after dark, you know, it opens up opportunities for the reinterpretation and creative use or misuse of space and the environment, which is you know, profoundly creative act, whether it's you know, through protest or you know, or other forms of, you know, human experience that as you say, like architects and designers may create with an intention for you know, a mainstream or daytime use of space, which can, you know, suddenly become a parkour for, you know, other interests or endeavors, you know, outside of those hours, which in itself is a, you know, often a profoundly creative act. And we see a lot of activities around, you know, the reinterpretation of space, the creative misuse of space and structures. And so I think, you know, as I think about it, you know, it does open up these opportunities for freedom and alternative realities, really, that I think are maybe just, you know, how we intuitively think of nighttime, you know, especially as I'm thinking of way back as youth, you know, there was always something about going out at night that, you know, all these opportunities that seem to be laid out before you, and you didn't know what they were, but you just sense this possibility. And of course, that I think there's an element of that with protest that, you know, or an idea of revolution that's closely related to that, you know, maybe things become possible or seem more possible under cover of dark, and that, you know, that's profoundly exciting and inspiring.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. It's like the notion that Shauna's dynamic envelope actually expands at night, are obviously a big part of night, and it's almost something that in our youth, or when we, or if not even in our youth, in our youthful engagement of some cities, when we first moved to a different city, when we first moved to a new place, that dynamic envelope somehow seems vast and wild, that moment of discovery. And the moment of discovery at night, I can remember when we first moved to Rome, walking around in the evening, the first time, and it was just Berlin too. The first evening you're there, it becomes a very, very different experience. Maybe this notion of, I guess, you know, we talked a little bit of, or we're sort of touching on this notion of the tensions, and that tension is about different things. It's about a kind of an ideological shift that maybe unheralded or unarticulated identities of the city. So the normative understanding of the city is different. And I think Tokyo, Alice's conversation around Tokyo it's converged. But this notion that the identities change and our personal identities somehow become freer. I put together, I'm not sure how you guys felt about it, but this notion that is the night inherently a place of inclusion, because we get to be different versions of ourselves. This is a bit more speculative, but I think it points to, for me anyway, the notion that we can express different things, whether we're expressing them through art. We can go to different parts of the city. There's this obvious relationship with surveillance, which is different. Can maybe we talk about our or at least not personally, but notions around identity and inclusion at night? Does it change? This might be the glass half full version of night, and we can talk about other qualities. But do we feel that, I guess, at night, this a more inclusive urban context? Shauna, maybe you want to touch on your dynamic envelope? I love that. I'm going to get a tattoo. Or sorry, dynamic tension.
Dynamic tension. Envelope's good too. So, and this is where I kind of like, I have a hard time kind of saying something is inherently anything, but I think there is a tendency for sure in the night to allow for more sort of egalitarian activity. And I guess, you know, how can the night, like going back to what Alice was saying, how can it be part of the making of more just cities, right? I think that's, probably the intention of artists and architects. Whether or not that's a static moment is, you know, is really challenging, because these sort of dynamics of, like, you know, challenge and then re-territorialization by governments and other institutions is going to be constant. And I think that, you know, the night is inherently politicized. We've got, you know, lots of the protests were happening and so forth, but I think also, you know, just given in Canada, for example, in the last week on the East Coast, you know, what was happening at night was not emancipatory activity. It was, you know, the confrontation between Mi'kmaq fishermen and non-Indigenous fishermen, and overnight, basically, their facilities were raided. You know, the lobsters they had fished and were storing were destroyed. You know, vehicles and buildings set ablaze. And so the night, because it escapes regulation, can also be a place of repression, right? So I don't think it's one thing, and I don't think it's kind of steadily, you know, I don't think it steadily leans in one particular direction. I think it's our responsibility and, you know, the interest of the public, basically, to maintain the night as a site for social justice. But how, you know, how do we do that, basically, I think is the question.
I think this notion of space of oppression is, I mean, let's live in the dark side for a while. We started this conversation with a very romanticized, or at least I did, because you know, you try to anyway, a sort of more romanticized notion of the power of the city, power of design in the city. But yeah, it is a space of oppression. I mean, I do remember in various cities that I've lived in, the police presence at night, just because at the end of the day, there's a greater level of control that's perceived as necessary. At least Rome was like that for a while. Like I'd love to talk about that for a while. Do we think the night is inherently this space of oppression, or at least we know it is? But how do we actually? I guess if it is it a place where we can battle that in some way, that we that it's inherently a place of oppression. You talked about the fisheries conflict on the East Coast, but there's many things going on in many different cities, and we know that the night is somehow where other forces control our city and understand it in different ways. There's these alternate realities. Anyway, I'd like to a space of fear or a space of oppression. Maybe that's a great kind of movement for the discussion. Alice, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think it's we have some clear survey that are saying how actually the exclusion and the oppression of night during the nighttime in cities, especially in America, are much more visible. So we have mapping, we have this map of American population, and we can see how during the daytime somehow the population makeup, it's more mixed, but once people goes back home and they go back to their neighbors, it's very much, we can see a kind of racial and spatial segregation. So during the nighttime, this is pretty much very visible during this mapping, especially in the United States. So there is a kind of very visible exclusion and oppression that is happening during the nighttime. We have also at the same time kind of positive example, seeing on the other side. And I think what Shauna was mentioning about this rhythm of the human being during the nighttime is different. And I think there are some ideas of how to reuse some parts of the city that are underused during the nighttime, and how we can actually reuse them in a different ways. And there is this project in São Paulo, is a huge highway that where during the daytime plenty of cars are passing through, and during the nighttime they stop the traffic for kind of kilometers, and this became a kind of a new public space for the city during the nighttime and during the weekend. So it's kind of giving to a city where there are not as much public space available a new open park. And I think this is a kind of amazing project to create also a community and a collectivity around of infrastructure that otherwise would be not as much used during the nighttime. So I think it's a kind of very interesting to work on this different rhythm and trying to use this absence of uses during the nighttime to find new solution, also to reinterpret some part of the city with new project, with new ideas, with new creativity that the night can also be bringing out always kind of new creativity, especially of the younger generation or subcultures. I think it's a very important factor that we can kind of reuse in our cities. So I think it's some negative side and some good side. I think there are both that we can talk about.
Does that go? Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Anthony.
Oh, I agree, and I think, you know, along with what Shauna was saying, I don't think that it's important to say the night isn't inherently anything, but you know, and I think it's important to balance like some of the ideas of like the romanticism of, you know, freedom with recognizing that a lot of people are scared to go out at night, and that's a form of oppression, and that you know, where I think just that we do see like a restructuring, and that provides both oppression and opportunities for different, you know, different individuals in different subject positions, and that that it's yeah, I think just wanted to say that, you know, it's not inherently a force, but it creates a different environment with different dynamics that individuals relate to according to their own position of, you know, where they are. And, you know, maybe it's, you know, I think one might argue that it may be, and again, I guess we can't generalize. I mean, so many cities are so different, but in my experience, you know, there are so many people that feel like the night is dangerous, or, you know, that they, you know, feel restricted in some way in terms of movement or activities.
Yeah, I think there's some inherent tensions there, dynamic or not, about, you know, the sort of elephant in the room is the fact that if I speak to my daughter about going out at night, it's a different context than if I speak to my son. It's just the way it is. There's a, but I think what's interesting about the last series of discussions is this notion of the night as a space or a place of fear, inherently of fear, goes beyond just notions of vulnerability because of gender, or vulnerability because of the unknown, but it's a place of fear in some places about some of the broader constructs of society that sort of define the space of night as this place of oppression that I think is interesting. Do we think that I guess I mean, if you take the positive side of this notion of protest, or in fact this notion of art projected into the city, which can be more challenging or more evocative, do we think, I see, or I think I see, designing for night, designing the project that Alicia has been talking about, or framing a project at night as a kind of projection as almost a laboratory of how the city could function during the day. I mean, is that a kind of valuable way? Is it distinct enough? Rome is distinct, very much night and day. We know that. Venice is distinct night and day. And do we think there's something that can be learned? Can the night become a kind of laboratory through art, through social justice, through a kind of specified urban design strategy? I'm going to put that question forward for whoever wants to jump in.
I think so. I mean, I would hope so. I guess. And it's, you know, what Anthony was saying about Nuit Blanche, for example. It's interesting. I was just thinking as you posed that question that Nuit Blanche has kind of stayed as a single annual event, right? As opposed to kind of territorializing other aspects of the cities that the events take place in. But it would be an interesting model, right? To sort of explore, if you're thinking about the night as a space of experimentation, you know, what elements can be transposed and how do we do that? And I liked Alicia's idea too of actually designing for the night, right? Projects that actually are quite, you know, intentionally sort of leading change and you know, focused on this night space.
An interesting idea. I was just, as you were speaking, Shauna, you know, thinking that, you know, Nuit Blanche is still a very controlled, structured annual event, and we haven't seen the closure of museums and that, you know, a night museum that replaces them, although that's an interesting idea. And of course, you know, some critics think of Nuit Blanches as a bit of a circus and not really the, you know, proper setting or reception of art, or, you know, that's in some way it's all about spectacle in the audience and draws attention away from the art. And that's probably a whole nother conversation for another day. But it does, yeah, it makes one, I guess, you know, I can see all kinds of reasons, but, you know, just that question, why don't we have a nightly outdoor art experience?
Yeah, Anthony, why don't we? It's a great question, right? I think.
Sure, it has something to do with money.
You said the S word, which was a kind of context for the beginning of this discussion. This notion of spectacle, and this notion that it seems almost inherent that when we do something at night, because it is about projection, because it is somehow subversive, I guess, or somehow louder than what we do during the day. It kind of has, it either has to resist or embrace this notion of spectacle. Again, I go back to Berlin, these notions of the things that actually change our perception of the city, that somehow, I can remember the first Love Parade in Berlin. I was, you know, at a certain point, it's an activity. So the nightclubs that are functioning in the city are functioning in a certain way. They decide that they want to take their experience for whatever reasons And at that time it was, well, anyway, and they push it onto the street. So essentially they take over the city through the late night into the dawn, and it becomes a parade along the Ku'damm. So the Sunday morning space of the Ku'damm, which is the Kufrisson, which is very, very controlled in many ways, becomes this space of spectacle, becomes this space of expression, becomes this space that it was almost like a sort of moving art project in many ways. It was certainly about protest. It was pushing the night city into the day in a way. It seems to talk about these thresholds that need to be blurred, or maybe that would help if we started to blur these thresholds somewhat, and the night will help us do that.
One thing. Oh, go ahead, Sean.
I was just going to say, some of that activity, if you think about like American cities the last few months, the the ephemeral monuments that basically have gone up, on wood paneling on fences, on doorways. So there is always kind of a spontaneous creative activity associated with the night, even like going back to graffiti, right, and things like that. But it's not formalized, right? And maybe that's how it should be, not formalized, basically, in order for it to, be a force of opposition and be a force of social justice.
This notion of street art as this thing that appears, we don't know how. I kind of know, because my son did a lot of street art for a while, and he'd disappear, he'd be gone, and you don't know when he'd get home. But at a certain point, then there's a piece would appear, and there'd be a sense of pride. It would be there. Then you'd be able to talk about it. It would exist for 3 days, or it would exist. There's a few that have been around for a couple of years. This notion that it becomes a kind of subversive place of making, of creativity, I think is that seems really valid. And I think it's something, again, that kind of ad hoc quality is something we should be able to build on within a kind of making, within a kind of more institutionalized making, or more structured making.
One of the one of the things that I think we were just talking about also, but also something we haven't really touched on is biology, and the fact that most of us are still not nocturnal creatures. And as much as having this conversation, kind of I'm becoming intrigued by thinking, oh yeah, I would love to go out more at night, but as I get older, I just go to bed earlier. And I mean, there is an element that that will always kind of overlay whatever plans one has, or opportunities one wants to create for great masses of people. But it's something to think about. I was also thinking about this concept of dorve, which is like a sleeping wakefulness that, I've read certain individuals can be incredibly creative at a kind of a waking sleepfulness in the wee hours of the morning. Like Benjamin Franklin would go out and invent things at 2 a.m. and when he was kind of half sleeping, half awake, and or even maybe thinking of working the tension of our physical capacity and limitations and how we design around that. I'm also thinking of a well-known curator who ostensibly hires a research assistant that comes in just before he goes to bed at midnight and researches for him till 6 a.m. and then they wake up and have breakfast and talk about all the research that got done while he was sleeping. And I've always been intrigued by that, but never been able to pull that off myself, and I'm not sure if I want to. But yeah, I'm just curious about the biology. Like there are definitely going to be limitations, even with all these ideas about what one can do at night. The pragmatic side, I guess.
Or there are also opportunities. I can remember when I was doing my graduate work, I just shared, there was a guy I shared a space with. He you know, his wife worked for the government. He was on her schedule. He was on a kind of 7:30 to 4:30 schedule, and I was on the opposite of that. So essentially, we just shared space, shared resources, shared tools. And if we were working on the same project, it would have been a very interesting kind of mechanism for creativity, a kind of a temporal charrette in a way, where you're throwing notions back and forth. I mean, sometimes that happens in architecture when you have international offices and you do a series of, you know, you make a series of speculations on a project, and then somebody responds in the Tokyo office or the Shanghai office responds back, and you wake up with either somebody doing something, changing what you did, or somehow riffing on it. But yeah, this notion about yeah, I mean, I think I'm in the same boat. I'm very aspirational about how late I can and may want to stay up. But at the end of the day, it's a different context for sure. I think it's pretty interesting. I think. Sorry, go ahead, Sean.
Just to build on that, I think, you know, I'm actually someone who I need to know there's a 24-hour, 24/7 cycle in the sites I'm in, even if I'm not going to use them necessarily. They give me. I like to have that. But I was also thinking there's sort of biology and there's also geography, right? And so where you are. So, you know, fact of heat, right? Heat, you know, in a climate will actually ensure there's a more lively night life because people avoid the heat of the day. But also, you know, sites like the north where the night is longer, right? And seasons of night, we have seasons of night and no daylight. So I think, you know, it's so contextual and specific, and that's sort of one of the things that that geography gives us, is sort of that sense of like we have to look, you know, very specifically at locations to sort of see the dynamics at play.
Yeah, I did some work in Iceland a few years ago. We gave a couple of lectures, and we were there, and then this notion that nighttime. We were there in one of the transitional zones, but the night was very long, and we spoke with some artists and some designers who spoke very succinctly about living within that sort of 24-hour night condition and what it means. And it is biological in some ways. It is a kind of it's a response that they have very interesting notions about what it does to the creative process. If you don't really know what time of day it is, if you don't really, or if it is expanded, that notion is expanded. I think this, Alice, any thoughts on this, on the sort of biological response tonight before we?
No, it's very interesting actually to talk about geographies. Actually, it's I've been in Finland in the opposite situation, and it was all the time daylight, and it was very tiring. I was exhausted and was working for a 2 weeks project, and it was really it was very hard to focus and work, actually, to be productive for me, maybe because I'm kind of I change time zone very often, but I kind of have a very precise night and day routine. So sometimes, of course, I enjoy the night, but it's kind of, I think, very confusing to lose this, to have a different amount of darkness and light. So I think it's very interesting. Yes, totally new spheres. Yeah.
We're I think we're up to our time limit. I know we've got a distinct slot, but when I was thinking about this with you guys in mind, because I know you so well, or I did know you so well. I haven't seen somebody for a long time, but we've known each other for a long time. And this notion that I was really interested in this notion of thresholds. It seems consistent. We talked about it at the beginning, and maybe we could just have just a bit of a riff on. You know, I don't want to say favorite, that's the wrong word, but I have periods in my life, or at least moments in my life, where I understood that nighttime, daytime threshold, those really important moments where you understand where you are in the world because you're experiencing that night-day relationship. And maybe it could be a nice way to just finish the conversation on what we think, where meaning lies in that, I guess, just quickly. Maybe I'll go to, or maybe I'll give, maybe I'll do my first one, so it'll give you guys a chance to think. so I don't want to put you, because I don't want you to get some errant emails after this saying, why'd you do that? So, you know, I can remember this was when we were living in Berlin and we were in a nightclub and we were doing whatever it is we were doing. And we left quite late, but then got up reasonably early on a Sunday morning and went to breakfast. And my friend Sean Solly, who teaches in Boston now, said he lost his coat. I had my car, so we drove back to the nightclub at about 12 o'clock in the afternoon. And both went into the nightclub, and literally there was no distinction between what was happening inside and what was happening inside at 12 noon on Sunday and what was happening inside at midnight on Saturday night. There was no distinction. Berlin, Sunday morning, Iron Glaze, the whole thing, coffee was all happening, but the night had extended. The threshold of the night through whatever was allowing people to have that much energy, it could have been many things, was allowing the night to extend, and you could see that it would extend across. So for me, that was that sort of a sort of simultaneous threshold that I thought was interesting. Do you guys have any closing amusing anecdotes? They have nothing to do with nightclubs, but I'm going to go to Anthony first.
Well, just that the experience you're describing also reminds me of casinos, like in, you know, of course in Vegas, and noon is exactly the same as midnight, and there's, you know, very intentionally there's no clocks in those spaces. And so it's actually interesting to think about designing an environment that denies the distinction between night and day. And I guess just, you know, just the thought that comes to mind, you talked about those liminal spaces or thresholds like Twilight, and it's kind of almost, you know, kind of folkloric or cultural, but I think there's a reason they call Twilight the magic hour.
Mm-hmm. Shauna, any thoughts? I think I've been out at night with you sometimes.
I think so. I get, you know, like I said, I think I am quite drawn to the idea of 24-hour culture. I like to have the access to that. And I get, you know, I do think, like Anthony mentioned, you know, the example of casinos. And I think, you know, what's been so interesting to me, I guess, in the last few months, the point I started out with is this, you know, the images of these cities that, you know, are primarily light, right, at night, like Vegas, like other sort of very, you know, cities that have a really strong night economy that are basically depopulated, right? And I think that that's, you know, it's interesting visually, but it's something to really think about, you know, in terms of, you know, urban impact and, you know, sustainability of cities.
Yeah. Like those cities try to resist night in a way. When Alice was talking about other constructs, this notion that somehow we try to deal with night by actually creating a day-like environment. That's it's almost politically resistant in an interesting way. It's saying it's pushing night as an identity away in a way.
It comes back to spectacle, I think, too. So if you think about, you know, sites like Luna Park, just the history of that sort of the theme park spectacle city connection.
All right, Alice, any thoughts on this notion of the the threshold, the most?
Yeah, I think it's what I was mentioning before is this. What is happening in Tokyo is like really, and it happened many times, to decide if stay all night outside or just go back home. And the moment of this decision moment when actually I think, okay, I just stay out. And then it's like, as you say, the expansion of the night is like huge in front of me. I think this is just my decision, my choice to do it. I think this is like the point of kind of freedom, let's say. Little freedom in a kind of, there is no time anymore, so it's like just leaving the city in a very human rhythm finally. So I think that's probably my really choice of deciding to just losing train, transportation, rationality. So I think that's for me the point of nighttime.
I think that's a beautiful kind of going back to Shauna's notion about the rhythms and even Anthony's comments around a more kind of biological or a more human notion that maybe the night is the place where we somehow are more human. We're somehow, due to those constraints, obviously it's a space of fear, it's a space of all the things that we spoke about, a space of protest, but it's also somehow without getting too it's a space where this notion that we feel more human. I think you said there's a closer link to our natural understanding of the world in a way. I think that's really beautiful way to finish it.